Picture yourself standing at the base of a massive stone structure, its surface worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. The scale is almost unimaginable. The labor, the resources, the sheer human effort required to build something so grand. But here's the mystery that has puzzled historians for generations. What if these ancient builders didn't intend for their creations to last forever? What if hidden within these monumental designs were deliberate flaws built in weaknesses meant to teach, to test, and to transform failure into something far more valuable than success? Across continents and millennia, civilizations invested everything into megastructures that were destined to crumble, collapse, or sink, and they did it for a reason. This is the paradox we're exploring today, the idea that some of history's most awe-inspiring constructions were engineered not to endure, but to educate. From the sinking temples of the Maya to the leaning towers of medieval Europe, we're going to journey deep into the past to uncover the hidden lessons behind these architectural marvels. You'll discover how failure became a teacher, how humility shaped innovation, and how societies used stone and mortar to explore the very limits of human ambition. By the end of this video, you won't just see ancient ruins, you'll see them as living classrooms where every crack and collapse held meaning. So join me as we unravel one of history's greatest mysteries, why the greatest builders of the ancient world chose to fail, and what that can teach us about resilience, creativity, and growth today. When you think of the great monuments left behind by ancient civilizations, you probably picture timeless wonders built to defy the age's structures that shout of permanence, power, and perfection. But what if that's only half the story? What if some of the most astonishing constructions from our past were never meant to last? It sounds almost unthinkable. Why would any society pour generations of labor, vast resources, and unparalleled ingenuity into something designed to fail? Yet that's exactly what the evidence suggests. Across the ancient world, from the humid rainforests of the Maya to the sun-scorched sands of Egypt, engineers and architects embedded intentional flaws, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities into their grandest projects. This wasn't a sign of incompetence. It was a profound and sophisticated choice, one that challenges everything we assume about historical engineering. For these cultures, failure wasn't something to avoid. It was something to study, to ritualize, and even to celebrate. Archaeologist Dr. Elena Torres, who has studied ritual collapse sites across Mesoamerica, puts it this way: we've long misread the evidence. What we see as structural failure was often by design, a way to physically manifest philosophical ideas about balance, impermanence, and human limitation. Take, for instance, the mysterious partial collapses found in certain pyramids. Where modern eyes might see engineering miscalculations, ancient builders may have seen powerful symbolism, a reminder that even the greatest human achievements are temporary. This ethos transformed construction sites into living laboratories, each controlled failure, a sinking foundation, a leaning wall, a deliberately weakened arch, served as a real-world test. Builders could observe how materials behaved under stress, how soils settled over time, and how structures responded to environmental pressures. These were experiments on a monumental scale, and the results were meticulously documented, often in oral traditions, artisan inscriptions, or early texts. In this light, a crumbling corner wasn't a disaster, it was data. Beyond the practical, there was also a deep spiritual dimension. In many societies, intentional structural flaws served as ritual offerings, a form of communication with the divine. A wall that was meant to crack or a chamber designed to settle could symbolize humility in the face of nature's power or the god's will. This ritualistic destruction wasn't about carelessness. It was a sacred act, an acknowledgement that some forces are beyond human control. This perspective stands in stark contrast to how many modern societies view failure. Today, we often treat setbacks as embarrassments to be hidden or avoided. We value success, efficiency, and flawless execution. But ancient cultures understood something we've largely forgotten: that true innovation isn't born from getting everything right the first time. It's born from the willingness to try, to fail, to learn, and to try again. These megastructures were classrooms in stone and mortar, teaching lessons in resilience, adaptation, and respect for natural laws. They embodied a delicate balance, the awe-inspiring ambition to reshape the world, paired with the humble recognition that we are part of something much larger. To understand why ancient builders would intentionally incorporate failure into their most ambitious projects, we first need to step into their world, a world vastly different from our own. Between 3000 BCE and the medieval period, humanity was undergoing a profound transformation. Societies were shifting from small, nomadic groups to vast, settled civilizations, and with that shift came an explosion of architectural ambition. This was the era of empire building, where cultures like the Romans, Incas, Mesopotamians, and Khmer were not just constructing buildings, they were making statements that would echo through the centuries. Historian Dr. James Mitchell describes this drive perfectly, noting that these megastructures were far more than functional spaces. They were the ultimate expressions of cultural identity, technological prowess, and a deep, often spiritual, desire to imprint a legacy upon the earth. But this ambition was tempered by reality. Builders operated with a toolkit that, while ingenious, was fundamentally limited. There were no computer models to simulate stress loads, no standardized steel beams, no precision engineering. Every project was a leap into the unknown, a massive experiment where the variables of material strength, soil stability, and environmental pressure were only partially understood. This inherent uncertainty made experimentation and, by extension, failure, a necessary part of the process. A bridge built to span a river might lean precariously after a flood, teaching engineers about current forces and foundation design. A tower in a public forum might settle unevenly, providing a live demonstration of soil composition and weight distribution. These weren't seen as disasters but as invaluable, real-world data points. The drive to build was fueled by a complex mix of factors. In some cases, it was sheer resource abundance, a surplus of labor, often from military conquests or centralized rule, that allowed for decades-long projects. In others, it was intense religious fervor. Constructing a ziggurat or a pyramid was an act of devotion, a way to physically reach closer to the gods. And frequently, it was raw political ambition. A pharaoh or emperor would commission a colossal structure to demonstrate their power, to unify their people under a common symbol, or to immortalize their reign in stone. The context of the time also deeply influenced design choices. Astronomy guided the alignment of temples and observatories, tying earthly structures to the celestial dance. Mythology was literally set in stone, with architectural forms echoing creation stories and cosmic beliefs. Expansive trade networks didn't just move goods, they moved ideas, allowing building techniques and philosophical concepts to cross continents and influence distant projects. So what drove these societies to gamble so much on these uncertain, monumental ventures? It was a combination of practical need, spiritual belief, and that timeless human yearning to create something that outlasts a single lifetime. They understood that to achieve something truly great, one had to be willing to risk spectacular failure. This willingness to learn from collapse, to see imperfection as a teacher rather than a flaw, set the stage for the incredible examples of architectural wisdom we're about to explore. Picture a sun-baked valley just outside ancient Rome, where a team of engineers stands in tense silence, their eyes fixed on a newly constructed segment of aqueduct. Water begins to flow through the channel for the first time, a steady stream that quickly builds into a powerful force. For a few moments, everything holds. Then a low groan echoes from the stonework. A single arch, designed with a subtle miscalculation in its curvature, begins to shudder. The mortar cracks, and with a thunderous roar, a section of the aqueduct collapses into the river below. But instead of cries of alarm or despair, the engineers erupt into a flurry of activity, taking detailed notes and measurements. This was not a disaster. This was class in session. The Romans, masters of empire building, were also masters of learning through deliberate, controlled failure. One of their earliest and most ambitious water channels, the Aqua Vetus, served as a massive open-air laboratory. Engineering historian Dr. Maria Rossi explains that scrolls from the era describe how builders would intentionally introduce slight flaws into their designs. A fractionally incorrect slope here, a marginally undersized support there. These weren't errors born of incompetence, they were carefully calculated experiments. The goal was to push materials to their absolute limit to understand precisely how they would behave under the immense stress of flowing water. The data gathered from these dramatic collapses was invaluable. It directly led to one of the most revolutionary building materials in history, pozzolana concrete. By mixing volcanic ash with lime and rubble, Roman engineers created a substance that could actually set underwater and grow stronger over time. This discovery transformed their architectural capabilities, turning the aqueducts from impressive experiments into the incredibly durable, empire-sustaining marvels we remember today. Consider the case of the Aqua Claudia, an aqueduct known for its early struggles with leaks and seepage. Initial sections built with traditional materials consistently lost water. Rather than seeing this as a defeat, Roman engineers meticulously documented every failure point. They discovered that the water pressure was exploiting microscopic gaps in the stonework and mortar. Their solution was ingenious. They developed a new waterproof mortar sealant and pioneered the use of a special pressed clay lining for the interior of the channels. This innovation, born entirely from observing failure, drastically increased the aqueduct's efficiency and became a standard technique for all future projects. The scale of these experiments was made possible by the Roman system itself. Vast resources, including highly organized slave labor and a military-like precision in project management, allowed them to undertake these large-scale tests. They could afford to build a section knowing it might fail because the knowledge gained would save immense time and resources on the next 10 projects. This pragmatic, forward-thinking approach is a hallmark of Roman engineering. They viewed each collapse not as a tragedy, but as a tuition payment for an education in resilience. The lessons learned on the Aqua Vetus and the Aqua Claudia didn't just fix one aqueduct. They were woven into the very fabric of Rome's infrastructure, enabling an empire to thrive by mastering the flow of water. Now, let's journey from the pragmatic world of Roman aqueducts to the dreamlike city of Venice, a place that seems to float on water itself. Imagine the scene in the 11th century. A master architect, his robes damp with lagoon mist, watches with intense focus as the great bell tower of St. Mark's the Campanile settles another fraction of an inch into the soft, silty ground. A nervous apprentice might have seen a catastrophe in the making, but the master saw a lesson unfolding exactly as planned. Venice was an audacious experiment from its very foundation, a city built on millions of wooden pilings driven into unstable mudflats. In this environment, building something that didn't move was impossible. So the brilliant Venetian engineers flipped the problem on its head. Instead of fighting the natural sinking, they designed for it, creating structures that were meant to settle, shift, and teach. As the Venetian chronicler Giovanni Battista noted in his writings, this was no secret. It was a celebrated strategy of assestamento intenzionale, intentional settling. The goal was to understand how the unique combination of materials and environment would behave over centuries, turning the entire city into a living laboratory for hydrodynamics and foundation science. The construction methods were a masterpiece of adaptive engineering. They drove thousands of alder wood pilings, a wood that petrifies and hardens when submerged deep into the compacted clay beneath the silt. On top of this, they built platforms of Istrian stone, a dense marble remarkably resistant to water erosion. But the true genius was in the cladding and the joints. The outer layers of the towers weren't rigidly locked in place. They were designed with a slight flexibility, allowing the marble panels to shift minutely against each other without cracking. This wasn't a sign of poor craftsmanship. It was a calculated feature to dissipate stress and monitor the building's movement. A perfect case study is the Torre dell'Orologio, the magnificent clock tower overlooking the Piazza San Marco. For decades, it developed a pronounced and worrying lean. Rather than panic, the city's builders observed, measured, and learned. The lean taught them invaluable lessons about the varying density of the soil across even a small geographic area, and how the weight of the massive clock mechanism affected the structure's balance. Centuries later, this data was used to carefully straighten the tower with a complex system of underground injections and reinforcements, a direct application of knowledge gained from its initial, intended failure. This philosophy created a fascinating interplay between beauty and resilience. The Venetians never sacrificed aesthetics for functionality. They understood that the two were inseparable. A tower that leaned precariously was not just an engineering data point. It was a part of the city's romantic, asymmetrical charm. This embrace of imperfection, this willingness to build flexibly and learn from constant, gradual change, is the very reason Venice has survived for over 1,500 years. Where a more rigid city might have shattered under the pressures of tides and time, Venice adapted. It learned to move with its environment, proving that the most enduring innovation isn't about creating something static and perfect, but about designing something alive, something that can learn, adapt, and grow even from its own slow descent. Leaving behind the watery challenges of Venice, we travel even further back in time to the sun-scorched plains of ancient Mesopotamia, the very cradle of civilization. Here, the Sumerians erected some of humanity's first and most awe-inspiring megastructures, the Great Ziggurats. These massive stepped pyramids reaching toward the heavens were not meant to be eternal, immutable monuments. Instead, they were designed to decay, to crumble in a carefully orchestrated dance with time, embodying a profound philosophical acceptance of life's natural cycles. At the heart of this practice was the magnificent ziggurat of a temple complex dedicated to the moon god Nana. Its builders made a deliberate and symbolic choice in its construction. The core of the structure was built with sturdy, high-quality fired bricks, but the outer layers, the visible facade that faced the relentless sun and wind, were often made with sun-dried mud bricks. These exterior bricks were far less durable, destined to erode and wear away over a relatively short period. This was not a shortcut or a sign of inferior resources. It was a built-in lesson plan for future generations. The inevitable deterioration of the outer shell forced a continuous cycle of maintenance and renewal, a communal activity that became a sacred duty. every time the priests and citizens of Ur gathered to repair the crumbling facade, they were not just fixing a building. They were actively participating in the renewal of their covenant with the gods, reinforcing social bonds and ensuring that the knowledge of construction and ritual was passed down through the ages. Archaeologist Dr. Liam Chen, who has studied these sites extensively, describes them as spiritual laboratories. The priests who presided over these temples were not just religious figures, they were early scientists and engineers. They meticulously observed the patterns of degradation, noting which walls crumbled first after a rainstorm, how the sun's angle accelerated erosion on certain faces, and how the wind sculpted the soft brick. These observations were then cross-referenced with celestial events and societal shifts. A particularly rapid collapse on the western side might be interpreted alongside a poor harvest or the movements of a specific planet, creating a complex predictive model that intertwined the physical and the divine. The engineering itself was brilliantly tailored to this philosophy. Ziggurats were built with a distinctly tapered design, their sides sloping inward as they rose. This shape naturally encouraged controlled crumbling. Erosion would happen gradually from the top down, shedding material in a way that was less likely to cause catastrophic, sudden collapse. This design allowed the community to manage the decay, to anticipate the need for repair, and to ritualize the process. Cuneiform tablets excavated from sites like Ur and Uruk detail these rituals, describing elaborate failure ceremonies. When a section of brickwork gave way, it wasn't a cause for mourning. It was a moment for celebration, seen as a divine message, a sign that the god required a renewed offering of labor and devotion from their people. The choice of materials was deeply symbolic. The sun-dried mud brick made from the earth and water of their homeland represented the temporal, earthly realm, impermanent and changing. The fired brick of the inner core, transformed by fire into something more resilient, symbolized the enduring divine presence within that impermanence. This physical dichotomy was a constant, tangible reminder of their worldview, that decay and renewal are two sides of the same coin, both necessary and sacred. In this way, the Sumerians wove the concept of failure directly into their greatest architectural achievements. A collapsing wall was not a mark of shame. It was an invitation to learn, to come together, and to engage in a continuous dialogue with their environment and their gods. It fostered a culture that saw improvement not as a one-time event, but as an eternal process, building a resilience that was both spiritual and technological, ensuring their legacy would be defined not by perfect stones, but by perpetual growth. Now, let's shift our gaze to the high plateau of southern Africa, where a different kind of architectural genius was at work. In the 11th century, the Shona people began assembling one of the continent's most stunning stone complexes, Great Zimbabwe, using a technique so precise it defies belief: dry stone walling without a single drop of mortar. Picture a master builder carefully selecting a massive granite boulder, hewing it into a perfect rectangular block, and then placing it atop another with such exactitude that a knife blade couldn't slide between them. These walls, some soaring over 30 feet high, were not meant to be static and unchanging. In certain sections, particularly within the vast, curved structure known as the Great Enclosure, builders intentionally created points of instability. They laid foundations that were slightly uneven or designed curves with a calculated degree of stress, knowing that over time, the immense weight of the stone and the dramatic temperature swings between day and night would cause these sections to settle, shift, and even crack. This wasn't a sign of error, it was a deliberate experiment in understanding the very land they built upon. anthropologist Dr. Aisha Okoye, who has studied the oral histories of the region, explains that these falling walls were a critical part of the Shona's knowledge system. The stories passed down through generations don't speak of collapse with shame, she notes. They speak of it as njir, a word meaning wisdom or intelligence gained through observation. A cracking wall was a teacher, showing how granite expands in the heat and contracts in the cool night, or how the sandy soil beneath would come packed under immense pressure. The builders were students of these failures. When a section of the hill complex, the oldest part of the city, crumbled after a heavy rain season, it revealed a crucial lesson about water. The collapse exposed how runoff was channeled beneath the walls, eroding the fragile soil supporting the foundations. This single event directly informed the sophisticated drainage systems found in later constructions, including a network of channels and ditches that expertly redirected water away from critical structures, preserving them for centuries. This philosophy of learning through controlled failure was deeply intertwined with Bantu worldviews, which placed a profound emphasis on resilience and communal problem solving. The concept of Ubuntu, the idea that I am because we are, meant that knowledge was not owned by an individual but was a collective resource. A builder's discovery about weight distribution or a new method for interlocking stones was not a secret to be hoarded. It was a lesson to be shared, ensuring the entire community grew stronger and wiser. The very reputation of Great Zimbabwe as a center of trade and architectural innovation, its influence stretching across the Indian Ocean, was built upon this willingness to test, to observe, and to adapt. The mastery displayed in its most stable and enduring sections was not an innate gift. It was hard-won knowledge, paid for by the intentional and studied failure of the stones that came before. Deep within the lush, emerald heart of the Mesoamerican rainforest, a different kind of classroom was taking shape, one where the very earth itself was both student and teacher. Here, Mayan engineers, who are also astronomer priests, undertook a breathtakingly patient experiment. They constructed massive pyramidal temples, not as monuments to perfect eternal stability, but as dynamic instruments designed to interact with and ultimately learn from the challenging jungle environment. The foundational sinking they observed at sites like Tikal was not a dreaded flaw. It was anticipated data, a slow-motion report on the hidden world beneath their feet. The temple of the giant jaguar piercing the canopy is a perfect example of this philosophy in stone. It wasn't built in a single, uniform push. Instead, it rose in distinct layers and phases, each using a slightly different mix of limestone aggregate, mortar density, and construction techniques. This wasn't arbitrary. By building with varying densities and carefully monitoring how each new layer settled over decades, the Maya could create a detailed map of the soil's composition and its behavior under different hydraulic pressures during the relentless rainy seasons. They were essentially taking a core sample of their own construction, learning which methods best distributed weight on the unstable, waterlogged ground. Epigrapher Dr. Carlos Mendez has spent years deciphering the glyphs that adorn these sacred sites. He points to specific passages that describe these projects not as finished tombs or temples, but as ongoing processes, what they termed living tests. The glyphs speak of a dialogue between human ambition and divine will, suggesting that the gods would communicate their approval or disapproval through the structure's performance. A crack appearing in a specific wall or a staircase settling at a certain angle wasn't a construction error to be hidden. It was a celestial message to be interpreted, a sign that the design needed adjustment to achieve greater harmony with the natural and spiritual worlds. The technical mastery behind this is astounding. The Maya used a construction method known as the corbelled arch, where each successive level of stones extends slightly inward until they meet at the top. It's a stable form, but one with inherent weaknesses under uneven pressure. Mayan builders would intentionally create points of tension within these arches, or use blocks of slightly different sizes and strengths to see exactly where and how fatigue would set in over centuries. This taught them invaluable lessons about gravity, load distribution, and the long-term behavior of their primary material, limestone, in a humid climate that constantly tested its integrity. We can see the tangible results of this iterative learning at the sprawling pre-classic city of El Mirador. Early pyramids there, like the massive Ladanta complex, experienced significant partial collapses, particularly in their ornate exterior stairways and summit temples. Rather than abandon the site, the Maya studied these failures meticulously. The lessons learned from watching how rubble fell and how walls buckled directly informed the designs of later structures at Tikal and Palenque. At Tikal, for instance, later temples feature much broader, more deeply founded stairways that are integrated into the core of the pyramid itself, making them far less prone to shearing off. The alignment of ceremonial spaces was also adjusted based on these observations, ensuring that even if a platform settled, it would often settle into a position that maintained its sacred astronomical sightlines to the rising sun or Venus. This entire process was overseen and documented by the astronomer priests, who served as the project's chief scientists. Their observations were a fusion of empirical data and spiritual interpretation. They logged the movement of stars alongside the movement of stones, seeing both as interconnected parts of a cosmic order. This embedded a powerful philosophy of iterative learning into the very heart of Mayan culture. Perfection was not a starting point, it was a destination reached through cycles of observation, adaptation, and reverence. For them, a subsiding pyramid base wasn't a mark of failure. It was the first and most important lesson in achieving a lasting balance with the immense, powerful forces of nature that surrounded them. Now, let's move from the dense jungles to the blistering heat of an Egyptian quarry, where the air shimmers over acres of rose-red granite. Here, the ambition of the pharaohs reached its most literal peak, the obelisk. These towering needles of stone, some weighing over 400 tons, were more than just monuments. They were acts of devotion carved from the living rock. But the process of creating them was fraught with peril, and the ancient Egyptians, in their unparalleled wisdom, designed these projects to include the very real possibility of failure as a core part of the learning process. Imagine the scene at the quarries in Aswan, where thousands of workers toil under the sun. Their goal is to free a single, perfect obelisk from the bedrock. Using nothing but rounded balls of dolerite, a stone harder than granite, they pound away, hour after hour, day after day, creating a deep trench around the intended monolith. The margin for error is vanishingly small. A single misjudged strike, a hidden flaw in the stone, or an unforeseen shift in pressure could cause a catastrophic crack, rendering months of back-breaking labor instantly worthless. And yet they pressed on, not in spite of this risk, but because of it. The most famous teacher in this harsh classroom is the unfinished obelisk, still lying in its quarry bed today. It is the largest known ancient obelisk, never completed because a devastating fissure appeared in its side during the quarrying process. While it's often presented as a simple accident, Egyptologist Dr. Hannah Sharp offers a more intriguing interpretation. She suggests that this and other flawed obelisks were intentionally left in situ as a permanent, open-air manual for future generations. The quarries were not just extraction sites, she explains. They were training grounds. A cracked obelisk was not a trash heap. It was a textbook. Tomb paintings and inscriptions show us that master craftsmen would bring apprentices to these sites to study the fractures, to run their hands over the grooves, and to learn from the mistakes immortalized in stone. They would analyze how the crack propagated, which tools might have been used at the wrong angle, or how the natural grain of the granite was not properly respected. This hands-on education directly informed the evolution of their tools and techniques. The case of the Lateran obelisk, originally commissioned by Pharaoh Thutmose III and now standing in Rome, is a perfect example. Historical records and archaeological evidence suggest that during an attempt to move it from the quarry, the immense monolith broke. Rather than abandon it, Egyptian engineers studied the break. They realized their sleds, while capable of moving the weight, could not distribute the pressure evenly across the obelisk's entire length during the initial, most jarring movement from its quarry bed. This single failure led to a redesign of the sleds and the development of new techniques for cushioning and balancing the load, innovations that would make the transport of all subsequent obelisks significantly safer. Beyond the purely practical, these failures held deep symbolic power. An obelisk known as a tekhenu to the ancient Egyptians was not just a stone pillar. It was a frozen ray of the sun, a physical connection between the pharaoh, a god on earth, and the sun god Ra. Its journey from the quarry to its final standing position was a ritual reenactment of the first sunrise over the primordial mound of creation. In this spiritual context, a crack or a break was not merely an engineering problem. It could be interpreted as a divine message, a test of the pharaoh's devotion and the people's perseverance. Overcoming these monumental setbacks became a metaphor for the struggle between order and chaos, a central theme in Egyptian mythology. The successful raising of an obelisk, especially one that had previously failed, was a triumph of cosmic proportions. It proved that human will, guided by learned knowledge and unwavering faith, could impose order on the chaotic forces of nature and fate. The enduring lesson from the Egyptian quarries is that their greatest strength was not just their ability to carve and move mountains of stone, but their profound understanding that the path to perfection is paved with instructive imperfections. High in the otherworldly landscape of Cappadocia, where wind-sculpted rock formations rise like chimneys from the earth, a different kind of architectural wisdom was being carved from the soft volcanic tuff. Here, Byzantine monks did not build upward. They built inward, painstakingly excavating entire monasteries, churches, and cities directly into the cliff faces. They understood a fundamental truth about their medium. This soft rock was alive. It breathed, it shifted, and it would inevitably erode. Instead of fighting this nature, they embraced it, designing their sacred spaces with an acceptance that certain elements were meant to fail, transforming their entire community into a living laboratory for studying the slow, powerful forces of nature. The Gurim Open Air Museum stands as a stunning testament to this philosophy. It isn't a single building but a complex honeycomb of chapels, refectories, and dwellings, all carved directly into the rock. Within these spaces, monks conducted deliberate experiments in stability. They would carve out chambers knowing full well that the soft, crumbly tuff of the ceilings or walls would eventually give way. This wasn't negligence, it was a calculated method of data collection. By observing exactly how a ceiling collapsed where the cracks first appeared, how the rubble fell, and how the remaining structure settled, they could develop more effective reinforcement techniques for the next chapel over. They pioneered early forms of rock bolts, inserting long, sturdy wooden beams deep into the rock to anchor unstable sections. They carefully engineered drainage channels to divert water away from critical areas, learning through trial and error which designs best prevented the destructive seepage that could dissolve their walls from within. Art historian Dr. Selim Yilmaz points to the vivid frescoes that adorn these caves, noting that many depict scenes of construction and rebuilding. These are not just biblical stories, he explains. They are visual records of a spiritual practice. To these monks, the physical labor of shoring up a collapsing wall was as much an act of devotion as prayer. It was a tangible way to participate in God's creation, to exercise stewardship over their earthly home, and to practice humility by acknowledging the impermanence of even their most sacred spaces. The engineering choices they made were brilliantly adaptive. Pillars were often left intentionally thick and unrefined in early constructions, their bulkier forms acting as test subjects for load-bearing capacity. Niches and alcoves were carved in specific patterns to create points of controlled weakness, allowing sections to erode gradually and predictably rather than causing a sudden, catastrophic failure. This gradual degradation gave the community ample time to observe, learn, and intervene with new solutions. A powerful example of this learning process is found in the Dark Church, so named for its minimal window openings which helped preserve its exquisite frescoes for centuries. Initially, this very design caused a problem. The lack of airflow led to moisture buildup, which weakened the ceiling rock and caused sections to fall. This failure, however, became a catalyst for innovation. The monks studied the fall patterns and the resulting air currents, leading them to carve ingenious, almost hidden, ventilation shafts that channeled fresh air into the deepest chambers without compromising the structural integrity of the church or the protective darkness that safeguarded the art. This solution, born from collapse, was then implemented across countless other chambers in the region. The entire endeavor was a collective, documented effort. Monastic communities kept detailed logs of their observations, passed down through generations. They shared knowledge about which rock layers were most stable, which angles could best withstand seismic shifts, and which mortar mixtures were most effective for repairing cracks. This communal documentation turned individual failure into communal wisdom. In the harsh, arid landscape of Cappadocia, this embrace of imperfection was the key to survival. It fostered a resilience that was both physical and spiritual. The monks learned to live in harmony with the inevitable decay of their world, seeing each crumbling wall not as a defeat, but as an opportunity for renewal and a deeper understanding of both their environment and their faith. Their greatest architectural achievement was not a perfectly preserved church, but a continuous, evolving conversation with the stone itself. Now, let's turn our attention to the bustling city-states of medieval Italy, where a fierce competition was underway, not just for wealth or power, but for the skyline itself. In the 12th century, rival families and communes raced to construct the tallest, most magnificent bell towers, symbols of civic pride and divine favor. But in places like Pisa and Bologna, the soft, alluvial soil presented a formidable challenge. Rather than see this as a limitation, a new generation of architects approached it as the greatest engineering puzzle of their age. They began constructing towers with a daring hypothesis that a controlled, intentional lean could become a masterclass in understanding the very ground beneath their feet. These were not accidents waiting to happen. They were experiments in motion designed to settle in precise, informative ways. Structural engineer Dr. Luca Bianchi, who has studied medieval construction logs, notes that these documents read more like scientific journals than simple ledgers. The builders were meticulous, he explains. They recorded the slightest shift in the foundation, the settlement of each new level, and the seasonal changes in the water table. This data was priceless. It was directly applied to the far more complex and heavy foundations of the Gothic cathedrals that would soon rise across Europe, saving countless projects from disaster. The technical execution of this was breathtakingly clever. To induce a specific lean, builders would deliberately vary the materials on one side of the foundation using a slightly softer stone or a less compacted mortar mix. As the tower rose, the uneven load distribution would cause that side to settle more deeply into the earth. This intentional instability created a living laboratory for studying counterweights and buttressing. Builders could observe in real time how much a specific lean could be counteracted by adding extra weight to the elevated side or by constructing supporting arches. The lessons learned from these tilting giants were then scaled up and applied to the soaring naves and flying buttresses of cathedrals, which relied on a perfect balance of forces to remain standing. A powerful case study emerges with the twin towers of Bologna, the Asinelli and the Garisenda. While the Asinelli tower stands relatively straight, the Garisenda was built with a much more pronounced lean from the very beginning. Its dramatic tilt was a deliberate extreme, a stress test pushed to the limit. Over centuries, the Garisenda taught master builders critical lessons about the compressive strength of brick and mortar under immense, off-center loads. It showed them how a structure could redistribute its own weight to avoid catastrophic failure, a principle that would become fundamental to later Renaissance architecture. This wave of architectural experimentation did not occur in a vacuum. The influence of Islamic engineering, particularly from Al-Andalus in Spain and the broader Muslim world, was profound. Islamic mathematicians and architects had already made significant advances in geometry and statics, knowledge that flowed into European centers of learning through trade and cultural exchange. The complex geometric patterns and arched structures seen in Moorish architecture informed the European understanding of how to manage forces and stresses, providing a theoretical foundation that gave builders the confidence to attempt these daring leaning experiments. So how did these precarious towers, these acknowledged experiments in controlled failure, become such enduring symbols of beauty and ingenuity? Their imperfection is precisely what makes them so human and so compelling. They stand not as cold, sterile monuments to flawless execution, but as vibrant testaments to curiosity, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is not famous in spite of its tilt, but because of it. That floor tells a story, a centuries-long narrative of observation, adaptation, and resilience. It demonstrates that a structure can be both imperfect and magnificent, that a calculated risk can yield breathtaking results, and that sometimes the greatest aesthetic and functional breakthroughs are found not in resisting nature's laws, but in gracefully, intelligently working with them. Deep within the steamy, monsoon-soaked jungles of Cambodia, the Khmer Empire undertook one of history's most ambitious experiments in coexistence. Their sprawling temple complexes, like the enigmatic Bayon with its serene, towering faces, were not built to conquer the landscape but to converse with it. Khmer engineers designed these sacred sites with a radical acceptance of a fundamental truth. In a climate defined by torrential rains and a relentless jungle, nothing could truly stand still. Instead of constructing impervious fortresses against nature, they designed temples that were meant to settle, to subside, and to be embraced by the very environment they inhabited. This intentional sinking was not a sign of defeat. It was a sophisticated strategy for learning how to achieve perfect balance with the natural world. Archaeologist Dr. Sophique Thong, who has spent decades studying Sanskrit inscriptions at these sites, explains this philosophy. The texts do not speak of structural failure with alarm, he notes. Instead, they use poetic language to describe a deliberate yielding to the waters, a purposeful subsidence meant to honor Varuna, the god of waters. It was an act of devotion, an architectural offering that acknowledged the supreme power of the natural elements. This spiritual framework transformed every construction site into a live field study in hydroengineering and ecological symbiosis. The technical execution of this vision was brilliant in its simplicity and foresight. The foundations of major temples were not laid on solid bedrock, but on deep beds of sand. This might seem counterintuitive, but it was a calculated choice. During the intense monsoon season, the water table would rise, saturating this sand and causing it to shift and compact in predictable, measurable ways. The temples would sink, but they would do so evenly, settling into a new, stable position. This controlled subsidence provided Khmer engineers with invaluable data on soil behavior, water saturation levels, and load distribution under extreme wet conditions. Simultaneously, they constructed vast, intricate canal systems and moats around the temples. These were not just decorative features or simple defenses. They were engineered to fail in specific ways. Canals were dug at carefully calculated gradients, designed to overflow into particular areas during exceptionally heavy rains. By observing exactly where the water spilled over, which fields were flooded, and how quickly the water receded, the Khmer could map the watershed with incredible precision. Each controlled flood, each intentional overflow, was a lesson that directly informed the design of their next and most crucial innovation, the massive barrages or reservoirs. These giant artificial lakes, like the West Barre, which is still visible today, became the lifeblood of the empire, storing water for the dry season and supporting a vast population. Their size, location, and intricate feeder canal systems were all designed based on the hydrological data gathered from the failures of the earlier temple complexes. The stunning temple of Tarprom, now famously locked in the grasp of giant strangler fig and silk cotton trees, offers a perfect case study in this adaptive learning. When initially constructed, the jungle was held at bay, but over time the Khmer allowed, and in some cases even encouraged, the roots to penetrate certain non-critical walls and galleries. They watched with meticulous attention as the powerful roots pried apart stones, causing controlled collapses. Rather than seeing this as destruction, they recognized it as a masterclass in vegetative integration. The lessons learned from observing how these roots provided natural reinforcement to some structures while destabilizing others led to revolutionary landscaping techniques. In later temples, we see evidence of trees and other vegetation being intentionally planted in specific locations to act as natural buttresses, their root systems helping to anchor earthworks and stabilize perimeter walls against erosion. This entire practice was deeply intertwined with the spiritual principles of Khmer Buddhism, which saw impermanence and decay not as something to be feared, but as an integral part of a continuous cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The gentle surrender of a stone wall to a tree root was a physical manifestation of this philosophy, a symbol of the harmonious interdependence of all things. This worldview fostered a uniquely sustainable approach to architecture that stands in stark contrast to our modern, often combative relationship with nature. The Khmer didn't seek to build structures that would forever remain unchanged and isolated from their environment. They sought to build structures that would adapt, evolve, and ultimately become one with the jungle itself. Their greatest achievement was not a temple that defied the elements, but a civilization that learned to listen to them, proving that the most profound and enduring adaptations often begin with the wisdom to yield. Journey now to the heart of the Persian Empire, to the dazzling city of Isfahan, where the skyline is punctuated by the majestic, turquoise-tiled domes of the Safavid era. Under the relentless sun of the Iranian plateau, these structures are more than just beautiful, they are brilliant scientific instruments. The architects here, funded by the powerful Shah Abbas, were masters of a unique discipline. They designed for controlled collapse, embedding deliberate weaknesses into their grandest creations to unlock secrets of physics and art that would have been impossible to discover any other way. The sublime Sheikh Lotfallah Mosque, with its impossibly intricate interior mosaics, serves as a perfect example. Its famous dome was constructed with a series of calculated stress points and carefully selected mortars of varying flexibility. As the intense desert heat baked the exterior by day and the cool night air caused contraction, these predetermined points would develop minute hairline cracks. To a casual observer, this might seem like a flaw, but to the master builders it was a data stream. They would listen intently to the way sound echoed through the chamber, noting how these tiny fissures altered the acoustics, diffusing the imam's prayers into a softer, more resonant whisper that seemed to emanate from the dome itself, creating an ethereal atmosphere of divine connection. Historian Dr. Parviz Azadi points to the poetry of the era, which didn't lament these cracks but celebrated them. The poets of Isfahan saw the fissures in the dome as a metaphor, he explains. They wrote verses comparing them to the cracks in a human heart, vulnerabilities that allow for a deeper resonance with the divine, that let the light in and the spirit out. A perfect, unyielding structure was seen as cold and distant. One that showed its history, that had adapted and settled, was alive. This philosophical acceptance of imperfection was backed by stunning technical innovation. The Persians pioneered the double-shell dome, an ingenious design with an inner and outer shell separated by a hollow space. This void wasn't just for structural lightness, it was a laboratory for studying thermodynamics. By designing the outer shell to expand and contract at a different rate than the inner shell, they could create predictable points of failure at the connecting ribs. Observing how hot air moved through this interstitial space and escaped through specially designed apertures at the dome's peak taught them profound lessons about natural ventilation. This knowledge was directly applied to cool the vast, airy interiors of the mosques and palaces, creating a comfortable refuge from the desert climate without any need for mechanical intervention. The lessons learned from these serene religious spaces were then tested under the more demanding conditions of royal power. At the Ali Kapı Palace, the gateway to the royal gardens, a grand music room was crowned with a beautiful yet problematic dome. Over time, the weight of the structure and the vibrations from ceremonial music caused it to settle unevenly, creating worrying cracks in the supporting walls. Rather than dismantle it, the Shah's engineers saw an opportunity. They studied the settlement patterns with meticulous care, using plumb lines and water levels to map every shift. This single failing dome became the catalyst for a major breakthrough in seismic design. The data gathered from its movement directly informed the development of more flexible brick bonds and the use of shock-absorbing layers of sand and gravel within foundations, features that would make subsequent Persian architecture remarkably resilient to the earthquakes that frequently shook the region. None of this revolutionary work would have been possible without the unique context of royal patronage. The Safavid court was a hub of intellectual and artistic exchange, where architects, poets, astronomers, and mathematicians collaborated freely. The Shah himself had a deep personal interest in these experiments, funding them not just for practical gain but for the glory and intellectual prestige of his empire. This environment gave architects the rare freedom to take risks, to build something that might fail, secure in the knowledge that the knowledge gained would be valued more highly than a perfectly pristine but uninformative structure. So what can we learn from the collapsing domes of Persia? They teach us that a flaw can be a feature if we have the wisdom to observe its effects. They show us that the pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of beauty are not separate paths, but can be wonderfully intertwined. The greatest artistic elegance often emerges not from rigid perfection, but from an intelligent and graceful adaptation to the inevitable forces of nature and time. High in the thin air of the Andes, where the very ground beneath your feet can shudder without warning, the Inca Empire faced a constant and formidable teacher, the earthquake. Rather than live in fear of these powerful tremors, their builders developed a radical form of architectural conversation with the earth, constructing fortifications that were not meant to remain rigid and still, but to dance. At sites like the immense Sacsayhuaman fortress overlooking Cusco, they assembled walls from colossal polygonal stones, each one a unique, irregular puzzle piece. The genius of these structures lies in their joints. The stones were not mortared together, nor were their edges perfectly straight. Instead, they were painstakingly shaped to fit against one another with minute, intentional gaps and interlocking angles. This was not a sign of primitive technique. It was a breathtakingly sophisticated seismic dampening system. When an earthquake struck, these precisely engineered walls were designed to do something extraordinary. They were meant to shift. The massive blocks would shudder, sway, and settle, a controlled, life-saving dance that dissipated the earthquake's destructive energy throughout the entire structure. Instead of cracking under the stress, the wall would simply resettle into a new, stable configuration, often looking exactly as it had before the tremor. Anthropologist Dr. Rosa Quispe, who has studied the oral histories of the Quechua people, explains the profound worldview behind this approach. The Incas did not see the earth as an inert platform, she says. They saw it as Pachamama, a living, breathing mother. An earthquake was not an attack to be defended against. It was Pachamama shifting in her sleep, a movement to be respected and accommodated. The oral traditions speak of these intentional movements in the walls as lessons directly from her, teaching the people about balance, resilience, and the necessity of flexibility in a rigid world. This philosophy transformed every construction project into a communal lesson in reciprocity, a core Inca value known as Aini, the back-breaking labor of cutting, moving, and placing these gigantic stones was not coerced. It was a reciprocal duty owed to the community and the empire. When a section of wall failed during a quake, it wasn't a cause for blame or shame. It was a collective learning opportunity. The entire community would come together to study how the stones had moved, which joints had held firm, and which had shifted too much. This shared analysis, this collective reading of Pachamama's lesson, directly informed the design of the next project. We can see the tangible results of this iterative learning at the fortress city of Ollantaytambo, a masterpiece of Inca urban planning. Early retaining walls built to terrace the steep hillsides experienced failures during seismic events. The stones, while massive, were initially cut with less precise joints. When they shifted, some would tumble down the slope, but the Inca builders observed these failures with meticulous attention. They learned that the key wasn't just size, but shape and placement. They began cutting the stones with even more complex, interlocking polygons and ensuring that each stone's center of gravity was tilted slightly inward toward the mountain. This meant that when the earth shook, the stones would sway inward and settle back into place, rather than outward and down the hill. The knowledge gained from these failing fortifications didn't just protect sacred sites, it safeguarded the empire's food supply. The same principles of flexible, terracing masonry learned at Ollantaytambo were applied to the vast agricultural terraces that lined the Andes. These terraces, which fed millions, were engineered to withstand tremors without collapsing, ensuring that a quake would not lead to famine. This was a life-saving innovation on a massive scale, born directly from the willingness to build structures that could fail in controlled, instructive ways. The entire endeavor reinforced a world view where humanity was in a constant, respectful dialogue with nature. Failure was not a verdict but a piece of that dialogue, a message to be interpreted, a puzzle to be solved collectively. By designing for intentional instability, the Inca didn't demonstrate weakness, they demonstrated a profound wisdom. They understood that true strength isn't about refusing to bend. It's about knowing exactly how to move so that you never break. Picture the bustling harbor of Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, where the colossal pharaoh's lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, towers over the Mediterranean. But its base, constantly lashed by saltwater and storm waves, tells a different story from its gleaming summit. Hellenistic engineers, in a stroke of brilliant foresight, had constructed the foundation with a deliberate vulnerability. They used a specific mix of limestone and mortar on the lower levels that was designed to erode at a predictable rate. This was not a hidden flaw, it was the entire point. These coastal sentinels were built as much to fail as they were to guide, serving as massive, open-air laboratories for the nascent science of marine construction. Maritime archaeologist Dr. Dimitrios Papadopoulos, who has studied construction logs recovered from ancient port sites, explains their method. The logs are incredibly detailed. They show that builders would create panels on the sea-facing side using different material compositions. They would then return season after season to meticulously measure the wear on each panel, cataloging exactly how much each specific mortar recipe had eroded. This data was priceless. It was a comparative study on a grand scale, directly informing the recipes used for the most critical parts of the harbor walls and breakwaters that protected the entire fleet. The technical execution was a masterclass in practical experimentation. Builders would create complex mortars, mixing lime with various additives like volcanic ash, crushed pottery, or even specific types of sand to alter their properties. They would then apply these different mixes to sections of the lighthouse base, carefully observing which formulations best resisted the corrosive cocktail of salt water and the relentless mechanical pounding of waves. A mix that showed minimal erosion after a storm season would become the new standard for the most vulnerable points of harbor infrastructure. This process of learning through deliberate degradation had a profound impact on navigational safety far beyond Alexandria. Consider the case of the Tower of Hercules, the ancient Roman lighthouse in Galicia, Spain, that still stands today. Its original foundation, built on a rocky outcrop battered by the fierce Atlantic, was designed to settle. Early keepers documented how the structure shifted slightly during great storms. Rather than a cause for alarm, these movements provided crucial data on how the underlying rock responded to stress. This knowledge directly led to an innovation in the lantern chamber itself. Engineers, understanding the foundation's behavior, developed a more stable and resilient pedestal for the massive fire basin, ensuring that the light itself remained steady and visible even during the tempests that caused the stone tower to shudder. This beacon of failure became a literal beacon of safety for countless sailors. The spread of this architectural wisdom was fueled entirely by the ancient world's bustling trade networks. Merchant ships sailing from Alexandria or Carthage didn't just carry spices, silks, and metals. They carried knowledge. A captain who had witnessed the ongoing maintenance and innovative repairs at the Pharos would share those observations with engineers in the next port. This informal exchange of lessons learned from structural failure created a feedback loop that accelerated marine engineering across the Mediterranean and beyond. A technique developed to save a lighthouse in Egypt might be adapted to fortify a breakwater in Greece or a dock in Italy. So how did these intentionally eroding structures, these monuments to their own impermanence, become such enduring symbols of guidance and safety? Their greatness lies not in spite of their flaws, but because of the wisdom those flaws produced. They stood as honest testaments to the power of the sea and to the human ingenuity that refused to simply conquer it, but chose instead to learn from it. Each piece of stone worn away by the waves was a question answered, a lesson learned that made maritime travel safer for everyone. In their controlled surrender to the elements, they illuminated the path forward not just for ships, but for human innovation itself. Now let's step into the roaring heart of the Roman Empire, where the deafening cheers of 80,000 spectators echo through the greatest arena ever built. The Colosseum, known to its builders as the Flavian Amphitheater, was far more than a stage for gladiatorial combat. It was a monumental exercise in social and structural engineering, designed with a hidden curriculum where controlled settling and calculated weakness were the star pupils. Roman architects approached this colossal project with a revolutionary mindset. They didn't just build for the grand opening, they built for centuries of use, understanding that the true test of their design would come from the unpredictable forces of massive crowds and the very ground beneath them. To master this, they engineered specific sections of the amphitheater to settle unevenly, transforming the entire structure into a dynamic laboratory for studying two critical forces: crowd dynamics and structural redundancy. The most fascinating experiments took place out of public view in the labyrinthine underworld known as the hypogeum. This vast underground network of tunnels, chambers, and elevators was the beating heart of the spectacle, where animals, gladiators, and stage sets were thrust into the arena above. Classicist Dr. Sophia Conti points to fascinating gladiatorial records that mention an adjustment period following the Colosseum's inauguration. The texts don't describe these early months as a flawless unveiling, she explains. They speak of a settling in phase, where the movement of people and machinery below the sand would cause the wooden floor supports and the underlying vaults to shift and settle. This wasn't a secret, it was an anticipated and carefully monitored process. The engineers expected the hypogeum to subside at different rates. By observing how these underground vaults behaved under the immense, shifting weight of the arena floor and the frantic activity beneath, they gathered invaluable data on stress distribution. This informed crucial adjustments to the arch designs and the spacing of support piers, ensuring the underground spaces remained functional and safe even as they moved. Simultaneously, these controlled settlements tested the efficiency of the vomitoria, the vast passageways designed to disgorge thousands of people in minutes. The slight, intentional warping of these corridors provided a real-world model for how crowds would flow under less than ideal conditions, leading to refinements in slope, width, and exit placement that became the standard for all future Roman public buildings. The engineering choices made throughout the Colosseum were masterclasses in adaptable, repairable design. The massive outer wall was built using enormous travertine blocks, but they weren't simply stacked. They were held together with iron clamps set in lead, a system that allowed for incredible flexibility. When the inevitable ground tremors or settling occurred, the clamps would bend and the lead would compress, allowing the entire structure to shift slightly without collapsing. This design accepted that movement and cracking were inevitable, and it provided a built-in solution. A powerful anecdote illustrates this perfectly. Not long after its completion, a significant crack appeared in the outer wall. Rather than panic, Roman engineers saw an opportunity. They studied the crack's trajectory and used it to develop a new, more robust type of iron clamp, which was then used to reinforce not only the Colosseum but also other major structures throughout the empire. This single failure and the innovative response it provoked directly enhanced the safety and longevity of Roman architecture for generations. Beyond the pure mechanics, these public experiments carried profound social implications. In a society where the emperor's power was displayed through grand public works, a visible crack or a period of adjustment was a potential political risk. Yet, the Romans brilliantly turned this vulnerability into a strength. The very act of publicly repairing and improving the Colosseum demonstrated the state's enduring commitment to its people's entertainment and safety. It showed that the empire was not static but dynamic, capable of adapting and improving itself, a powerful metaphor for Roman resilience itself. The Colosseum, therefore, became the ultimate symbol of this pragmatic adaptability. It stood not as a fragile, perfect monument, but as a robust, evolving machine for spectacle. Its planned imperfections, its willingness to settle and be adjusted, ensured that it could host unimaginable grandeur for centuries, proving that the greatest public safety features are often born from the courage to build in the knowledge that some things are meant to move. Now, let's cross the continent to the river valleys of ancient China during the illustrious Song dynasty, where a quiet revolution in bridge building was taking place. Here, master engineers approached their craft with a philosophy that might seem counterintuitive to modern minds. They designed weakness into their structures to uncover the secrets of ultimate strength. Picture the scene along the Zairo River, where a team observes the inaugural load test of a new stone arch bridge. As heavy carts rumble across, a low grinding sound emanates from a specifically designed joint. A hairline crack appears precisely where the builders intended. Instead of alarm, there are nods of satisfaction and the scratching of brushes on rice paper as they record the minute shift. This was not a flaw, it was the bridge speaking its first lesson. These magnificent structures, like the timeless Anji Bridge, were conceived as dynamic educators in stone, designed to teach profound lessons in harmonic balance, load distribution, and resilience against nature's most furious assaults, particularly the annual fury of flood season. Engineer and historian Dr. Y. Zhang, who has spent years translating Song dynasty technical manuals, underscores this deliberate approach. The historical texts are remarkably frank, he explains. They speak of Xian Ta or trial collapses not as disasters, but as essential, planned phases in the mastery of arch construction. A bridge that collapsed in a controlled test taught you everything you needed to know to build 10 that would never fall. The technical execution of this philosophy was nothing short of brilliant. The stone segments of these arches were not locked rigidly in place. Instead, they were fitted together with carefully calculated tolerances, creating joints that could absorb energy and allow the entire structure to flex and breathe. During an earthquake, the bridge wasn't meant to resist the Earth's movement stubbornly. It was designed to dance with it. The individual voussoirs, the wedge-shaped stones forming the archer, would shift minutely against one another, dissipating the seismic forces throughout the entire structure before settling back into a stable equilibrium once the trembling ceased. This understanding, born from observing intentional failures, transformed a static pile of rock into a living, responsive entity. A powerful case study of this iterative learning is found in the majestic Lugu Bridge, famous for its countless exquisitely carved stone lions. Earlier versions of this bridge, built with more rigid, mortar-heavy techniques, developed serious cracks during seasonal flooding when the swollen river would slam debris against its piers. Rather than simply building the next one stronger, the engineers built it smarter. They studied the crack patterns, learning how the water's force was transmitted through the stonework. This led to a revolutionary development, the widespread use of dovetail joints and iron cramps between the stones. These features didn't eliminate movement, they managed it. They allowed the bridge to flex under impact without coming apart, much like a tree bending in a storm. This approach was deeply infused with the principles of Taoist philosophy, which profoundly influenced Song dynasty thought. Taoism taught of the Tao, or the way, the natural flowing order of the universe. It emphasized Wu Wei, often translated as effortless action or non-forcing, the wisdom of working with natural forces rather than struggling violently against them. A bridge builder who tried to construct an immovable object in the face of a movable force, like a flooding river, was acting in defiance of the Tao. But a builder who created a structure that could yield, adapt, and harmonize with those forces was following the way. The intentional weak joint was not a sign of disrespect to the material. It was a sign of profound respect for the river. It was an acknowledgement that the water possessed a power that could not be conquered, only accommodated. So how did these bridges, designed with such calculated vulnerability, manage to stand for well over 1,000 years, outlasting countless empires and modern structures alike? Their longevity is the ultimate testament to the success of this philosophy. The lessons learned from each controlled crack, each observed settlement, and each documented trial collapse were encoded into the very DNA of Chinese engineering. Each generation of builders stood on the shoulders of those who had willingly learned from failure before them. They didn't just build bridges, they built a cumulative, ever-deepening conversation with the physical world, a dialogue where every flaw was a question answered, and every collapse was a foundation for a more durable future. High above the bustling medieval towns of France, a breathtaking and perilous race towards the heavens was underway. In the shadow of half-finished naves and amidst the clatter of stonecutters' yards, master masons embarked on a daring architectural quest, pushing their craft to its absolute physical and spiritual limits. Their ultimate ambition was to construct the tallest, most magnificent spires ever conceived, reaching so far into the sky that they might physically bridge the gap between the earthly and the divine. But this was no mere contest of vanity. These soaring stone needles, like the iconic spire of Notre Dame de Paris before its fire, were conceived as profound experiments, a simultaneous test of faith and physics, where a calculated imbalance was not a flaw, but the very key to unlocking greater understanding. The approach was breathtakingly bold, guild records meticulously studied by art historian Dr. Jean-Luc Moreau reveal a culture of deliberate probing of structural boundaries. We find entries that speak not of accidental miscalculations, but of intentional essays de hauteur tests of height. Dr. Moreau explains, a master mason would approve a design with a known, subtle instability in the spire's initial framing, a slight off-centering of weight or a specific stone chosen for its unique grain. The intent was to observe how the entire structure, from the pinnacle down to the deepest foundation, would respond to the relentless pressure of the wind over the first few years. This was high-stakes science conducted hundreds of feet in the air, with an entire city's spiritual heart as the laboratory. The engineering itself was a masterpiece of adaptive design, where elements were arranged not just to support but to instruct. The iconic flying buttresses, those graceful stone arms leaping from the exterior walls, were not static props. They were dynamic components designed to channel forces in specific, measurable ways. Masons would intentionally vary the angle and thickness of these buttresses, or slightly alter the weight of their pinnacles, the decorative stone crowns that topped them. The goal was to create a controlled point of failure. They wanted to see which buttress would groan first under a gale's force, which joint would show the initial hairline crack. This data was priceless. It revealed exactly how the building was distributing its immense load and resisting lateral pressure, allowing them to reinforce subsequent constructions with surgical precision. No example illustrates this harrowing learning process more powerfully than the Cathedral of Saint Pierre de Beauvais. In a breathtaking push for supremacy, its builders vaulted the choir to a dizzying and unprecedented height of 157 feet. For a time, it stood as a triumphant marvel, Then, in 1284, just 12 years after its completion, the excessive strain proved too much. The vaults, pushed beyond their tested limits, catastrophically collapsed inward. While a tragedy, this failure was not an endpoint. It became the most influential structural lesson of the Gothic era. The collapse provided irrefutable, tangible evidence of the critical relationship between height, width, and support. The masons who studied the rubble at Beauvais learned exactly where the proportional limits lay. This hard-won knowledge directly informed the designs of every major cathedral that followed, ensuring their greater stability and longevity. The fall of Beauvais's choir taught Christendom how to build taller and safer. Fueling these audacious experiments was an immense and profound religious fervor. In the medieval worldview, the universe was a divine creation governed by God's perfect laws, including the laws of physics. To build a cathedral was to participate in that creation, to study and honor those laws. Therefore, a collapse was rarely seen as a simple engineering failure. It was interpreted by many as a divine correction, a sign that human ambition had overreached, that the builders had misread the natural order. This spiritual framework gave them the resilience to continue. A fallen spire was not a mark of shame upon the community. It was a humbling lesson from God Himself, a directive to try again with greater wisdom and humility. This perspective transformed potential despair into renewed devotion, ensuring that work would always begin anew. It is this very embrace of imperfection, this courageous dialogue with failure, that cemented the Gothic cathedral's status as an eternal icon of human aspiration. Their greatness does not stem from a cold, sterile perfection. It emanates from their visible struggle, their adaptive reinforcements, and their hard-won balance. They are not frozen in time but are narratives in stone, telling a story of ambition, collapse, learning, and redemption. The slight lean of a tower, the later addition of an extra row of buttresses, the variations in design between one bay and the next, these are not flaws. They are the physical evidence of a centuries-long conversation between human ingenuity and the immutable forces of nature. In their pursuit of heaven, medieval builders discovered that true elevation comes not from ignoring our limitations, but from gracefully, devoutly, and intelligently engaging with them. Now, let's cross the sea to the islands of Japan, where for over 1400 years, the silhouette of a pagoda against the sky has represented not just a place of worship, but a profound dialogue between spiritual acceptance and seismic reality. In a land constantly shaped by the Earth's restless energy, Japanese master builders developed an architectural philosophy that seems almost contradictory. To achieve perfect stability, one must first embrace graceful movement. They constructed their iconic multi-storied pagodas not as rigid monuments to defy nature, but as flexible, breathing entities designed to sway, to settle, and to dance with the tremors that regularly shook the ground. This was not a compromise, it was the entire point. The pagoda's very form became a sophisticated classroom for studying damping techniques and a physical manifestation of the Buddhist principle of impermanence, teaching generations that true resilience lies in adaptability, not in unyielding strength. The magnificent 5-story pagoda at Horyuji Temple, one of the oldest wooden buildings on Earth, stands as a timeless testament to this intentional flexibility. From the moment its final tile was placed in the 7th century, it was never meant to stand perfectly still. Its central pillar, known as the Shinbashira, does not actually bear the weight of the structure in the conventional sense. Instead, it acts like a massive pendulum suspended from above, hanging loosely through the center of the pagoda's hollow core. When an earthquake strikes, each of the 5 stories, constructed as independent, box-like frames, is engineered to sway independently. The Shinbashira then swings in the opposite direction, its rhythmic counter-motion absorbing and dissipating the earthquake's violent energy, preventing the waves from amplifying through the structure. This brilliant system transforms a potentially destructive force into a gentle, survivable rocking motion. Architect Dr. Kenji Tanaka, who has dedicated his career to studying these ancient techniques, sheds light on the deeper genius behind the joinery. The wooden pegs and brackets that hold these pagodas together, he explains, were not designed for eternity. They were designed with a calculated lifespan. They are meant to wear down, to compress, and to eventually need replacement. This replaceability is not a flaw. It is the very essence of the design. It forces a continuous cycle of maintenance, inspection, and renewal. Each time a craftsman replaces a worn bracket, they are not just fixing a building, they are reading a history of the stresses the pagoda has endured, learning from its performance, and subtly improving the design for the next generation. This creates a living structure that evolves and adapts, growing wiser and more resilient with each passing century. The construction method itself is a masterpiece of safe failure. The entire pagoda is an intricate web of interlocking wooden joints, assembled without a single nail. The primary technique, known as nuki, involves threading long, penetrating tie beams through the central pillars of each story, locking the frame together with a combination of tension and compression. During a tremor, these joints are designed to flex and groan. They allow the wood to rub against itself, creating friction that further dampens the shaking. The structure gives just enough to avoid breaking, moving as a single, cohesive unit that bends with the wind and earth rather than fighting against it. It is a lesson in controlled, graceful failure written in cedar and cypress. We can see the cumulative power of this knowledge in the towering pagoda of Toji Temple in Kyoto. Soaring over 180 feet, it is Japan's tallest wooden pagoda and has withstood centuries of earthquakes that have flattened less enlightened structures. Its legendary resilience is not a product of magical materials or luck. It is the direct result of applied learning from the controlled movements and minor failures of its predecessors like the one at Horyuji. The techniques refined at Toji, the precise angles of its brackets, the specific grain orientation of its beams, the optimal weight distribution of its tiles, became a model replicated and adapted across Asia, forming the foundational principles of modern anti-seismic engineering. This entire architectural philosophy is deeply intertwined with the Japanese aesthetic and spiritual concept of wabi-sabi, the profound appreciation of beauty that is imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete. A pagoda that sways is not seen as unstable. It is seen as authentically engaged with the natural world. The wear on a wooden joint is not a sign of decay to be hidden, but a cherished record of time's passage and the structure's history. This cultural value system reframed vulnerability not as a weakness to be eliminated, but as a source of unique character, elegance, and ultimately, profound safety. It prompts us to ask a powerful question: can a structure that never moves, that never shows its age, ever truly teach us how to survive in a world that is constantly changing? The Japanese pagoda answers with a quiet, unwavering confidence, demonstrating that the highest form of strength is found not in rigid resistance, but in the intelligent, beautiful, and designed capacity to yield. Imagine the flat, waterlogged landscape of the 17th century Netherlands, where the very ground you stand on was once the bottom of the sea. Here, Dutch engineers faced a paradox that would define their nation. To claim land from the water, they first had to let the water claim some of their land. In a breathtaking act of controlled surrender, they designed their earliest canals and dikes with a radical intentionality, building sections of the banks to be just weak enough to erode or breach under pressure. This was not negligence, it was the highest form of hydraulic respect. They understood that to win their eternal war against the sea, they needed to first learn its language, and the best teacher was a carefully orchestrated failure. These engineered collapses transformed the Dutch countryside into a vast, open-air laboratory for land reclamation, where every breach was a lesson and every flood was data. Historian Dr. Annelies van Dijk, who has spent years deciphering the meticulous polder diaries kept by local water boards, explains their method. These diaries are astonishingly frank, she notes. They document intentional, small-scale breaches in secondary dikes during controlled conditions. The engineers would note the exact wind direction, the tide level, and then watch with intense focus as the water rushed in, carrying its load of silt and sand. They weren't just causing a flood, they were conducting a geological survey, using the water itself to map the composition of their seabed and to see how different soils settled when the flow slowed. The technical execution of these experiments was a masterclass in practical learning. The Dutch became unparalleled materials scientists out of sheer necessity. They would construct stretches of dike using different compositions varying the ratios of clay, sand, and peat, or reinforcing sections with different types of brushwood and fascines. Then they would wait for a storm. By observing which sections held firm and which yielded, they could create an empirical database of material performance under duress. The slope of the dike was another critical variable. A steeper slope might be more efficient with materials, but would it withstand a direct wave assault? A gentler slope used more land but might dissipate energy more effectively. There was no textbook answer. The only way to know was to build both and see which one failed first and how. The legendary Beemster Polder project stands as a monumental testament to this philosophy. Early attempts to drain this massive lake were repeatedly thwarted by collapses in the surrounding ring dike. The windmills of the era, while ingenious, simply couldn't pump water out fast enough to counteract the constant seepage and pressure from the surrounding land. Each breach was a costly disaster, but the Dutch learned from everyone. The specific patterns of these failures taught them crucial lessons about hydrostatic pressure and groundwater flow. This hard-won knowledge didn't lead to abandonment. It led to a technological arms race. The demand for more powerful pumping directly catalyzed the evolution of the windmill itself, leading to the development of the larger, more efficient smock mill, and ultimately the iconic Dutch windmill with its complex system of sails and gears, capable of moving unprecedented volumes of water. This entire endeavor was underpinned by a unique social innovation, cooperative governance. The constant, shared threat of annihilation by water forged a remarkable culture of collective action. Local water boards, known as Waterschappen, were among the earliest forms of democratic governance in Europe. Every landowner, from the wealthiest noble to the humblest farmer, had a stake and a voice in these decisions. Funding these dangerous experiments and maintaining the resulting infrastructure required universal buy-in. This meant that the decision to intentionally breach a dike was not taken by a distant king, but by a council of those whose homes and farms would be directly affected. This system fostered an incredible social resilience and a deep, shared understanding that short-term sacrifice for long-term knowledge was the only path to survival. The Netherlands, as we know it today, is quite literally a nation built upon the foundation of learned failures. Every inch of its prized farmland was wrested from the sea, not in a single, triumphant battle, but through a long, painful campaign of strategic retreats and carefully studied losses. The controlled breakdowns of those 17th-century canals did more than teach engineers about silt and slopes. They taught an entire society how to collaborate, innovate, and persevere. They reveal the profound truth that sometimes to build something enduring, you must first have the courage to let a part of it crumble. For nearly 1,000 years, the fate of an empire hinged on a series of stone barriers so formidable they seemed to defy the very logic of warfare. The Theodosian walls of Constantinople were not just a defensive line. They were a complex psychological instrument and a dynamic classroom in military engineering, designed with a secret curriculum that included their own calculated failure. While the outer facades presented an image of unbreachable perfection to any approaching army, Byzantine engineers had woven a more nuanced truth into their very fabric. Certain sections, particularly in the outer curtain wall, were constructed with a deliberate vulnerability, using a slightly weaker mortar mix or a less stable foundation. This was not a flaw in their craft, but the pinnacle of it, a strategic invitation designed to teach lessons in attrition, counterattack, and the art of the trap. Military historian Dr. Leo Andronicus, an expert on Byzantine warfare, explains this cunning strategy. The logs of the city's military engineers reveal a fascinating tactic. They would identify sacrificial zones, often in areas with natural topographic advantages for the defenders. A breach there would funnel the enemy into a predetermined killing field, where they could be bombarded from the higher inner walls on 3 sides. It was a brutal but effective lesson in controlling the battlefield, turning the enemy's momentary success into their greatest vulnerability. The construction methodology itself was a masterpiece of rapid response and resilience. The walls were not a single monolithic structure but a layered system of an outer wall, an inner wall, and a wide terrace in between. The builders used a brilliant combination of materials, large blocks of limestone for the main facing, backed by a core of rubble and brick. This brickwork, arranged in specific patterns, was key to the repair strategy. When a section of the limestone outer shell was inevitably battered down by siege engines, the rubble core would often hold, creating a steep, unstable slope of debris that was incredibly difficult for attackers to climb. More importantly, the breach would be a clean one. The way the stones and bricks were laid meant that a collapse would often happen along predictable lines, creating a gap that could be quickly shored up overnight with pre-prepared wooden palisades, rubble, and even hastily assembled walls of earth-filled barrels. This allowed the defenders to negate an enemy's hard-won advantage before the next day's fighting even began. The ultimate test and the ultimate validation of this philosophy came during the famous siege of 1453. For weeks, the massive cannon of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II pounded the ancient walls, creating several major breaches. Yet the defenders, drawing on centuries of accumulated knowledge from previous attacks and smaller breaches, were ready. They had learned exactly how the Theodosian system failed under pressure. They knew which sections could be abandoned and which had to be held at all costs. They employed mobile stockades and concentrated their most elite troops at the critical points, fighting ferociously in the confines of the breaches themselves. The final Ottoman victory was achieved not by simply overwhelming a passive wall, but by overcoming a deeply adaptive defense that had been honed through a millennium of learned failures. Beyond the pure mechanics of stone and mortar, these walls wielded a powerful psychological weapon, the appearance of immortality. An army arriving at Constantinople was faced with a defensive system that seemed to heal itself overnight. A breach that had taken weeks of exhausting labor to create might be partially sealed by the next morning, sapping the morale of the attackers and fueling a legend of the city's invincibility. This psychological endurance became a core part of the Byzantine identity, a symbol that their empire, though constantly tested and often battered, could always rebuild and endure. So what does this teach us about the nature of strength? the walls of Constantinople stand as a monumental rebuttal to the idea that a perfect defense is an impenetrable one. Their true strength lay not in being unbreakable, but in being repairable. It was a defense built on the assumption that failure was inevitable, and that the real strategic depth was not found in the miles of territory behind the walls, but in the accumulated wisdom of how to respond, adapt, and overcome each new breach. They teach us that the most resilient systems are not those that never fail, but those that are designed to learn from every break. Descend with me now into the cool, shadowed depths of Western India, where a different kind of temple was being carved not upward toward the sky, but deep into the welcoming earth. Here, Rajput architects were mastering an art of inversion, creating magnificent stepwells known as bayoris or vavs, that were as much about community and contemplation as they were about water. Imagine the scene during the scorching dry season. Teams of artisans are carefully finishing the final steps of Chand Bayori, one of the largest and most complex of these structures. But their work is not aimed at creating a pristine, unchanging monument. As they smooth the edges of the sandstone steps, they intentionally leave certain sections with a slightly softer finish, or use a more porous stone for specific courses, knowing that the relentless flow of the monsoon rains will soon begin to wear them down in a precise, instructive pattern. This gradual erosion was not a design flaw to be prevented. It was a vital data stream, a built-in lesson plan written in water and stone. Anthropologist Dr. Priya Mehta, who has studied the intricate inscriptions adorning these sites, explains their purpose. The texts are remarkably clear. They speak of Jolacharya, the discipline of water, and describe how the intentional wearing away of the steps was a form of ritual purification. Each monsoon, the water would physically scour the well, but it would also metaphorically wash away the old, renewing the structure's spiritual vitality and its practical function. The erosion was a sacred form of maintenance. This spiritual framework transformed the stepwell from a simple reservoir into a living entity in a constant cycle of renewal, where physical decay was inextricably linked to spiritual rebirth. The technical execution of this vision was a masterclass in material science and observation. Builders became brilliant geologists, selecting different types of sandstone and marble for their varying resistance to water. Softer, more easily eroded stones were strategically placed on the steps that would receive the most direct force of the incoming water during the peak of the monsoon. Harder, more resilient stones were used for the central pillars and critical supporting arches. This created a calibrated system of wear markers. After each rainy season, the custodians of the stepwell would descend and measure the depth of the wear on these specific steps. The rate of erosion gave them an incredibly accurate understanding of that year's water velocity, volume, and even the sediment load carried by the monsoon, data that was crucial for predicting water availability for the coming year and for planning maintenance on the surrounding agricultural channels. The breathtaking Rani Kai Vav in Gujarat stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site today precisely because of the lessons learned from its ancestors' failures. Earlier stepwells in the region experienced catastrophic collapses when subsurface water pressure during exceptionally heavy monsoons would undermine their foundations, causing entire sections to slump inward. The builders of Rani Kai Vav studied these collapses with meticulous care. They realized that the water needed a way to escape the structure's base during times of flood. Their ingenious solution was to incorporate a sophisticated, layered drainage system directly into the new design. They constructed a series of graded channels and escape vents within the foundation itself, allowing excess water to percolate out safely without damaging the intricate sculptural walls. This innovation, born directly from observing structural failure, is a primary reason the stepwell has survived for over a millennium. but the true genius of the stepwell lay in its function as a social and intellectual nucleus. In the blistering heat of the Indian plains, these deep, cool, subterranean complexes became the central gathering place for the entire community. As women came to collect water and travelers stopped to rest on the myriad steps, the stepwell became a vibrant hub for the exchange of more than just jars of water. It was where farmers shared observations about soil and rainfall, where artisans discussed new techniques, and where the measured wear on the steps provided a common, tangible reference point for conversations about the environment. The stepwell was a university whose curriculum was hydrology, architecture, and community planning, all taught by the patient, relentless teacher of flowing water. This ancient wisdom, where decay is not an end but a sustainable beginning, feels startlingly relevant today. Modern water management engineers are now looking back at the principles of the stepwell for solutions to contemporary problems like urban runoff and groundwater recharge. The idea of building structures that work with erosion, that see water as a partner in a cycle of renewal rather than a destructive force to be concreted over, is a powerful legacy of these Rajput experiments. They demonstrate with elegant clarity that a society can flourish not by building walls against nature's processes, but by designing spaces that embrace and learn from them, proving that a structure designed to gracefully decay can be the very thing that sustains a culture for centuries. Now let's journey even further back in time to the windswept moors and rolling green hills of Neolithic Europe. Here, under vast, unpolluted skies, communities began a project that would outlast empires, the construction of great stone circles. We often imagine these megaliths as static, timeless monuments, perfectly aligned to the heavens from the moment they were raised. But what if that permanence is an illusion? What if the true purpose of these circles was not to stand perfectly still, but to move, to settle, and to teach through their very imperfection? Picture the scene over 4,000 years ago on the Salisbury Plain. A community gathers not with the goal of achieving a flawless, final arrangement, but to begin a generations-long experiment. They haul a massive sarsen stone into a prepared hole, but they don't pack the foundation tightly. Instead, they leave it loose, knowing that over the coming years, the weight of the stone will cause it to settle, to tilt, to find its own natural balance in the earth. This wasn't a lack of skill, it was the application of a profound and patient wisdom. They were building a slow-motion observatory, designed to be readjusted and refined by their children and grandchildren. As archaeoastronomer Dr. Fiona MacLeod's research into post holes around sites like Stonehenge has revealed, these were not set-and-forget constructions. The pattern of post holes around the main stones tells a story of constant, deliberate change, she explains. We see evidence of stones being carefully lifted, moved a few degrees and reset, not just once but over centuries. This was a deliberate process of calibration. The circle was a living instrument, and its tuning required periodic adjustment. The engineering choices made this possible. The giant stones were placed in pits filled not with solid concrete, but with a carefully selected mix of crushed chalk, rubble, and soil. This aggregate fill allowed for gradual, controlled settlement. As winter frosts heaved the ground and summer rains softened the earth, the megaliths would shift minutely. The builders anticipated this. They knew that a stone that settled into a slightly new angle over a decade wasn't failing. It was providing a new data point in a celestial calculation that spanned generations. A stone that leaned a fraction more to the east after a wet season might now perfectly frame the rising midwinter moon in a way it hadn't before, unlocking a new understanding of the lunar cycle. We can see this long-term learning process beautifully illustrated at the Callanish stones on the Isle of Lewis in Scotland. This complex cross-shaped arrangement shows clear evidence of multiple phases of construction and realignment. The central monolith and the surrounding circle appear to have been adjusted over time to refine their alignment with the major standstill of the Moon, an event that only occurs every 18.6 years. This means that the builders who started the project would never have seen the full cycle completed within their lifetimes. They were building and calibrating an instrument for their great-grandchildren, trusting in a collective, intergenerational project of discovery. Each slight movement, each intentional resetting of a stone based on decades of observation, slowly honed the circle's accuracy, turning it into a more and more precise calendar and predictor of celestial events. This incredible endeavor was about far more than just astronomy. It was a monumental exercise in social organization and spiritual belief. The act of moving these multi-ton stones required the coordinated labor of hundreds of people, a feat that would have been impossible without a shared, deeply held purpose. The process itself, the communal pulling, the precise positioning, the patient observation, and the periodic readjustment, was a ritual that reinforced social cohesion and shared identity. The spiritual significance is deeply woven into this practice of imperfection. In a worldview where the earth was alive and the heavens were a manifestation of the divine, a stone circle that never moved would be a dead thing, disconnected from the dynamic cosmos it sought to measure. The fact that the stones settled and had to be corrected was not a sign of human error, but a reflection of a living, breathing relationship with the universe. It was a physical dialogue between the earthly and the celestial. The imperfections, the need for adjustment, were sacred. They were reminders that humanity's role was not to control the cosmos, but to listen to it, to learn from it, and to harmonize with its rhythms. So how did these circles of shifting stone become eternal classrooms? They taught lessons in astronomy through patient, empirical observation. They taught lessons in engineering through the practical management of massive weights and unstable soils. But most importantly, they taught a lesson in humility and perspective. They stand as a testament to a culture that thought in centuries, not seasons. A culture that understood that the greatest secrets of the universe are not unlocked in a single lifetime, but are passed down like a slow, careful chant from one generation to the next, with each slight adjustment of a stone adding a new note to the song. Beneath the sun-scorched plains of the ancient Persian Empire, a hidden network of veins sustained life in one of the most arid regions on Earth. These were the Qanats, miraculous underground canals that tapped into distant aquifer water and guided it for miles through the desert using nothing but gravity. But the Achaemenid engineers who masterminded these subterranean rivers embedded a secret deep within their designs. Certain segments were intentionally built to fail. In the absolute darkness of these tunnels, a controlled collapse was not a disaster. It was the first lesson in a masterclass on water security, teaching invaluable lessons about geology, resource management, and how to protect a civilization's most precious resource from both human greed and natural law. Historian Dr. Reza Sharoni points to fascinating royal decrees from the era that actively encouraged this practice. The edicts didn't punish engineers for a tunnel breach, he explains. They incentivized it. They called for marish-e-andakte, planned decay, recognizing that the knowledge gained from a deliberate failure in a secondary channel would improve the efficiency and security of the entire imperial network. It was a state-sponsored investment in long-term learning. The technical execution of this was a stroke of genius. The Qanat builders, known as Muqanis, were master geologists. They would vary the slope of different tunnel sections by minuscule degrees, carefully observing how these changes affected the water's flow speed. A steeper slope might prevent sedimentation in one area, but could also increase erosion and the risk of a collapse further downstream. They also engineered the ventilation shafts or madangs, which dotted the desert surface above the tunnel's path to serve as pressure release valves. By slightly altering the spacing and diameter of these shafts, they could control airflow within the tunnel, which in turn influenced moisture levels and the stability of the walls. They were essentially conducting large-scale experiments in hydrogeology, using the Qanat itself as their laboratory. The legendary Gonabod Qanat in modern-day Iran, still flowing after over 2,700 years, stands as a timeless testament to this iterative learning. Early sections of this monumental tunnel experienced breaches where the ceiling, weakened by a hidden layer of unstable soil, would give way. Instead of simply repairing the damage, the Mukani studied the collapse with meticulous care. They analyzed the soil composition that had failed, mapped the precise water pressure that had caused it, and observed how the breach affected the flow and water quality downstream. This single failure led to a revolutionary development, a standardized and highly detailed maintenance protocol. It dictated exactly how to reinforce tunnels in similar soil types, how often specific sections needed inspection, and created a specialized toolkit for preemptive shoring up of weak spots. This protocol, born from observed failure, was then disseminated across the empire, drastically extending the lifespan of countless other Qanats. This network of failing, learning waterways became a powerful engine of Persian influence. The technology of the Qanat was so effective that it became a sought-after export of imperial power. As the Persian Empire expanded, its engineers would be sent to construct Qanats in conquered territories. This was not just an act of ecological imperialism, it was a profound political statement. By gifting a region the technology to turn desert into farmland, Persia fostered loyalty and dependency. The Qanat was a life-giving artery, and control over its knowledge and its occasional, instructive failures cemented Persian authority more effectively than any army ever could. The echoes of this ancient wisdom are strikingly relevant today. In a world facing increasing water scarcity, modern engineers are looking back to the principles of the Qanat for solutions. The idea of using controlled, small-scale failures to understand and manage a larger system is a cornerstone of modern sustainable agriculture in arid regions. The Qanat teaches us that attempting to build a perfect, failure-proof system is often a futile effort. True resilience comes from designing systems that are observable, repairable, and adaptable, where each breakdown is not a catastrophe but a scheduled lesson in survival. The Persian Mukanis understood that to ensure water flowed for millennia, you first had to learn exactly how and why it might sometimes stop. Imagine the shimmering heat of a Mughal garden in Kashmir, where the air is thick with the scent of roses and the gentle murmur of fountains. Here, amidst the geometric perfection of flowerbeds and water channels, master architects are engaged in a delicate dance with fragility. They are designing exquisite marble pavilions, not for brute strength, but for a specific, calculated vulnerability. Thin, polished marble platforms are laid with a slight, almost imperceptible weakness in their support, and ornate jolly screens, those intricate latticework windows, are carved with patterns that concentrate stress on certain fine filaments of stone. They are building for the graceful crack, the elegant failure, understanding that true beauty often resides at the very precipice of collapse. These gardens were not just places of leisure, they were open-air laboratories of aesthetic philosophy, where the limits of material and form were tested in pursuit of a higher harmony. Art restorer Dr. Samir Ahmed, who has studied the original chronicles of these sites, describes this ethos perfectly. The Mughal texts don't speak of repairs with embarrassment, he explains. They use poetic terms like nazak ishq, which translates to delicate passion. A crack appearing in a specific arch was not a flaw to be hidden. It was seen as the structure expressing its character, its history, and its interaction with the world, a vital part of the garden's evolving narrative and beauty. This perspective transformed a structural concern into an artistic consideration, where every hairline fracture was a verse in the garden's ongoing poem. The engineering behind this was deceptively sophisticated. The jolly screens were not merely decorative, they were functional instruments of this philosophy. By carving certain areas of the screen to be deliberately more delicate, architects could control exactly where and how a failure would occur. A fine filament of stone might eventually snap under the weight of a creeping vine or the settling of the foundation, but it would do so in a way that created a new, equally beautiful pattern of light and shadow, rather than causing a catastrophic collapse of the entire screen. Similarly, the platforms on which people walked were often made of stunning but relatively thin marble slabs. These were placed on supports that were designed to settle unevenly over time. The goal was to observe how the marble flexed and where it developed stress fractures. This data was invaluable, teaching builders about the tensile strength of different quarries' marble and how to better distribute weight in future, more critical structures like palace floors and balconies. A clear case study of this learning process unfolds at the Nishat Bog, the famed Garden of Joy. Its central pavilion, overlooking the Dal Lake, developed a series of pronounced cracks along its eastern facade within a few decades of its completion. Initial investigations suggested the foundation was to blame, but upon closer study, architects realized the issue was more nuanced. The beautiful but heavy marble cladding on that side was absorbing the full force of the afternoon sun, causing it to expand at a different rate than the brick core behind it. This thermal differential was creating immense shear stress, resulting in the cracks. This failure became a pivotal lesson in material interaction. For subsequent pavilions, including those at the nearby Shalimar Bog, the architects adapted. They began using a lighter, more flexible mortar between the marble cladding and the brick core, creating a buffer zone that could absorb the differential expansion and contraction. They also redesigned the foundations to be more resistant to the damp conditions near the water's edge, incorporating better drainage and moisture barriers. This direct application of observed failure led to more resilient and enduring designs. This entire approach was a sublime fusion of two great artistic traditions. From their Persian heritage, the Mughals brought a love for geometric order, symmetry, and paradise gardens as a representation of heaven on earth. From their Indian context, they absorbed the spiritual concept of Leela, the divine play of creation and destruction, and the aesthetic principle of Jadad, the appreciation for the life and history imbued in aged objects. A cracked pavilion was a manifestation of Leela, a participant in the divine play of the universe, and it gained Jadad, a soulful character that a perfect new structure could not possess. This invites a powerful reflection. Can our modern pursuit of flawless, sterile perfection ever achieve the depth of beauty found in something that has been tested, weathered, and gracefully adapted? The Mughal gardeners would answer that elegance is not a state of pristine completion, but a continuous process of dialogue between design and decay. Their pavilions teach us that the most refined artistry often emerges not in spite of failure, but through an intelligent, poetic, and respectful collaboration with it. Stretching across some of the most unforgiving deserts and mountain passes on Earth, the Silk Road was not a single path but a vast, pulsating network of trade and ideas. To survive its immense distances and extreme conditions, travelers relied on a chain of silent sentinels, the watchtowers that dotted the horizon. But these towers were far more than simple beacons. They were sophisticated desert laboratories, built with the explicit understanding that their foundations were meant to sink, to settle, and to teach. Constructed from the very earth they stood upon, a mix of sun-dried adobe bricks reinforced with straw, these structures were designed to interact with the brutal environment. Their gradual, controlled subsidence into the sand was not a sign of neglect but a critical feature, a way to gather real-time data on the stability of the ground beneath them and the forces of the wind that sculpted it around them. Historian Dr. Anwar Hussain, who has spent years poring over fragile caravan logs and ledgers, uncovers the purpose behind this. The logs are very specific, he notes. They don't describe a collapsing tower as a disaster. They use terms that translate to the tower has found its rest or the sand has accepted the marker. This intentional sinking was a way to create a permanent, physical record of a safe route. A tower that settled evenly into the dunes without toppling indicated stable, compacted ground ideal for camels and carts. A tower that listed severely or cracked signaled a treacherous area of shifting sands to be avoided. This transformed the entire network into a dynamic, three-dimensional map written in leaning stone and settled earth, where every instance of structural failure added a crucial data point to the collective knowledge of every merchant who would follow. The construction methods themselves were a masterclass in adaptive, localized engineering. Builders used thick adobe bricks not for their permanent strength, but for their thermal properties and their predictable failure modes. The straw mixed into the clay wasn't just a binder. It created a network of tiny capillaries that allowed the bricks to breathe, absorbing minimal moisture from the rare rains and releasing it slowly to prevent sudden erosion. More importantly, the straw would eventually rot away over years of exposure. This deliberate degradation happened at a known rate, causing the bricks to crumble in a controlled manner that builders could observe and measure. They learned which brick recipes, which straw lengths, and which wall thicknesses would withstand the searing daytime heat and the freezing nights for a predictable number of years before needing repair. This taught them profound lessons about thermal regulation, how a thick adobe wall could absorb heat during the day and radiate it back at night, creating a more stable microclimate for the guards stationed within. The towers became giant thermometers and hygrometers, their rate of erosion providing a long-term record of climatic conditions and teaching builders how to better design for extreme temperature fluctuations. A powerful example of this iterative learning process culminates at the western end of the Great Wall of China, at the formidable Jiayuguan Fort. This massive gateway complex, known as the Last Pass Under Heaven, was the final checkpoint for caravans leaving China and entering the vast uncertainties of the Taklamakan Desert. The watchtowers that guarded the approaches to Jiayuguan were the petri dishes for its design. Earlier, simpler towers built further out in the desert experienced rapid subsidence on their western sides due to the prevailing winds constantly scouring away the supporting sand. Others, built on what seemed like solid ground, succumbed to the hidden subsurface erosion of an occasional flash flood. The builders of Jiayuguan studied these failures with meticulous care. The data on how the desert towers settled and eroded directly informed the fort's legendary resilience. They constructed its massive foundations using a layered technique of rammed earth and rubble that mimicked the most stable natural strata they had observed. They angled its formidable walls to deflect the worst of the wind-borne sand, a lesson learned from watching how the desert towers were sculpted by the elements. The knowledge gained from the silent, sinking sentinels of the Silk Road was literally baked into the bricks of one of the most iconic defensive structures in human history. Beyond the pure mechanics of survival, these towers facilitated an incredible exchange of more than just goods. They were nodes in a vast communication network where architectural ideas were traded as freely as silk and spices. A Persian engineer might note the unique corbelled arch design of a Sogdian watchtower that seemed to settle more evenly. A Chinese builder might observe the way Central Asian towers used woven reed mats beneath their foundations to distribute weight on unstable soil. These observations were carried along with the caravans, cross-pollinating construction techniques across continents. A tower that failed in a novel and instructive way in the Pamir Mountains could influence the design of a new caravanserai in Samarkand a generation later. This cultural and technological exchange, fueled by the shared need to overcome a hostile environment, turned the Silk Road into a university without walls. The gradual, intentional deterioration of these structures provided a common language of problem-solving, a silent curriculum that taught patience, observation, and adaptation to all who passed by. They stand as a testament to the idea that the most desolate and challenging landscapes can become the greatest teachers, and that sometimes the most reliable map forward is not one that avoids failure, but one that is carefully charted through its lessons. Imagine the vibrant, competitive atmosphere of Renaissance Florence, a city buzzing with artistic and intellectual fervor, where the greatest architectural challenge of the age loomed overhead: the gaping, unfinished hole in the roof of the Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral. For decades, it had defied solution, a public testament to the limits of medieval engineering. Then came Filippo Brunelleschi, a goldsmith with no formal architectural training, who proposed a radical idea that would define an era. He and his peers were not just building a dome, they were conducting a monumental public experiment, pushing materials and mathematics to their absolute limits. Their masterstroke was not to avoid stress, but to design for it, embedding deliberate weaknesses into their grandest creations to uncover the deepest secrets of structure and form. These domes were conceived as dynamic educators in brick and stone, designed to teach through controlled, observable failure, transforming the Florentine skyline into the ultimate classroom for a new kind of engineering. Architect Dr. Giovanni Ferrari, who has spent a lifetime studying their workshop sketches, reveals the method behind the majesty. The drawings are incredibly revealing, he explains. We see them marking specific points in the dome's curvature, calculating where the maximum tension would occur. These were not hidden flaws, they were designated stress points, deliberately engineered into the design. The goal was to create a structure that would communicate its struggle, that would show them exactly where it needed help, turning the entire construction process into a live lesson in load distribution. This philosophy of learning by doing, by observing how a structure behaved under immense self-weight, was the very engine of Renaissance innovation. The technical execution of this vision was nothing short of revolutionary. Brunelleschi's design for the Florence Cathedral dome is a perfect case study in intelligent stress management. He employed a stunning herringbone pattern for the brickwork, a technique borrowed from ancient Roman ruins but applied with newfound mathematical precision. This pattern was not merely decorative, it was a critical structural innovation. Each curving course of bricks acted like a row of bookends, channeling the immense gravitational forces along specific, predetermined paths and preventing the wet mortar from being squeezed out before it could set. Furthermore, he designed the dome as a double shell, an inner and outer layer connected by a hidden skeleton of ribs and rings. This created a complex, three-dimensional system where the spaces between the shells became a laboratory for observing how compression and tension interacted. The lantern he planned for the summit was not just a decorative cap, it was a final, crucial weight. Its substantial mass was calculated to press down on the top of the dome, actively counteracting the outward thrust that threatened to burst the walls apart, essentially using gravity to fight gravity. This entire system was designed to be readjusted as the dome rose, a responsive and adaptive approach to construction that accepted movement and stress as inherent partners in the process. The lessons learned in Florence did not stay in Florence. They traveled to Rome, where they were applied, tested, and refined on an even grander scale at St. Peter's Basilica. The initial designs by Bramante and San Gallo resulted in a dome that began to show alarming cracks in its supporting piers almost as soon as it was completed. Michelangelo, who took over the project later in his life, and finally Giacomo della Porta, who saw it to completion, were not starting from scratch. They were the beneficiaries of Brunelleschi's experiments. The worrying fissures in St. Peter's were not seen as a catastrophe, but as a detailed diagnostic report. They showed subsequent engineers precisely where the forces were becoming too concentrated. This direct observation led to a series of brilliant interventions, including the addition of massive iron chains, tension rings, wrapped around the dome's base to act like a barrel hoop containing the outward thrust. This solution, born from the visible failure of the initial design, became a standard technique in large-scale domes for centuries to come. Fueling these high-stakes experiments was an intensely competitive cultural environment. The Renaissance was not a time of quiet collaboration. It was an era of fierce rivalries and proud city-states, each vying to outdo the other in artistic and architectural splendor. The dome was the ultimate status symbol, a testament to a city's wealth, power, and intellectual might. This competitive drive provided the necessary pressure and funding for these audacious experiments. Patrons were willing to take enormous risks on unproven designs because the reward, eternal glory and civic pride, was deemed worth the potential for a very public and spectacular collapse. This environment gave visionary engineers like Brunelleschi the freedom to propose ideas that seemed almost insane, turning the cityscape into a thrilling arena where the boundaries of physics and art were tested in full view of the world. So how did these intentionally stressed and sometimes cracking domes come to crown the greatest era of artistic achievement in human history? Their enduring beauty is inseparable from their engineered resilience. They stand as the ultimate synthesis of science and art, proving that the pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of beauty are not separate paths, but one and the same. The Florentine Duomo is not magnificent in spite of its complex, stress-managing design. It is magnificent because of it. The lessons learned from its construction, and from the failures it was designed to avoid, elevated architecture from a manual craft to a sophisticated science, demonstrating that the most profound elegance often emerges from a respectful and intelligent dialogue with the very real forces of failure. Carved into the towering sandstone cliffs of the American Southwest, the dwellings of the ancestral Pueblones stand as a stunning testament to a life lived in intimate conversation with the rock itself. These were not static structures frozen in time, but dynamic, evolving homes engineered with a profound understanding that their walls were meant to change, to erode, and to teach. Imagine a community high at Mesa Verde, not as helpless victims of a harsh environment, but as brilliant architects of their own survival. They constructed entire villages like the sprawling Cliff Palace, not with the goal of defeating the elements, but of learning from them, designing their world to fail in specific, instructive ways that would reveal the secrets of sustainable living on a vertical frontier. Each carefully placed stone and each mix of mud mortar was part of a long-term experiment in adaptation, where a crumbling wall was not a crisis, but a scheduled lesson in resource management and structural innovation. Archaeologist Dr. Maria Martinez, who has spent decades studying Pueblo oral histories, explains this unique relationship with the built environment. The stories passed down do not speak of decay as loss, she notes. They use terms that translate to the canyon breathing or the cliff making room. A section of wall that wore away was seen as the land participating in the life of the home, creating an opportunity to rebuild with newer, better knowledge. It was a form of renewal, a cycle as natural as the changing seasons. This philosophy transformed their entire settlement into a living laboratory, where the very process of deterioration was a form of data collection, guiding every subsequent generation toward greater resilience. The technical execution of this vision was a masterclass in responsive design. The primary building materials were the very substance of the cliff itself, sandstone blocks, held together with a mortar made from local clay, sand, and water. But the mixes were far from uniform. Builders would create mortars of varying consistency and composition, applying them to different sections of a wall. A softer, more porous mortar might be used on an exterior, south-facing wall that received the full force of the sun. A harder, more durable mix would be reserved for critical load-bearing pillars. This was a deliberate calibration. Over time, they could observe which mixtures eroded fastest under the summer heat, which held firm during the winter freeze-thaw cycles, and which best resisted the scouring of wind-driven sand and rain. The patterns of wear became a detailed environmental report, teaching them which recipes provided the best insulation, which offered the most stability, and which could be most easily repaired when the inevitable weathering occurred. They weren't just building walls, they were programming them to fail in informative ways, turning their entire village into a network of sensors monitoring the microclimates of the canyon. A powerful example of this iterative learning process unfolds at Cliff Palace itself. This magnificent complex of over 150 rooms is nestled deep within a towering alcove, protected from the worst of the weather. Yet early archaeological evidence reveals a history of partial collapses, particularly in the storage chambers set further back in the shadows. Initially, these deep, cool rooms were ideal for preserving corn, beans, and squash. However, the builders discovered that these recessed areas had higher humidity levels and poorer air circulation, which caused the mortar in certain walls to remain damp and eventually weaken, leading to the slumping of entire sections. Rather than abandon these prime storage spaces, they studied the failures. The solution they developed was brilliant in its simplicity and effectiveness. They began constructing these rear storage rooms with a double-wall technique, leaving a narrow air gap between the outer cliff face and the inner storage wall. This created a passive ventilation system that allowed air to circulate, drawing out moisture and keeping the grain dry while simultaneously stabilizing the temperature. This innovation, born directly from observing structural failure, revolutionized their food security, allowing them to store surpluses for years and sustain a large population in an arid landscape. The knowledge gained from a collapsing wall in one room led to a design feature that safeguarded the entire community's most vital resource. This practice was deeply intertwined with a cultural worldview that revered cyclical renewal. In the cosmology of the ancestral Pueblones, time was not a linear march toward a finished state, but a continuous loop of creation, decay, and rebirth. This was reflected in their architecture. A kiva, a circular, partially underground room used for ceremonies, would be ritually closed and filled in before a new one was built directly on top of it. The act of rebuilding was not a chore but a sacred reiteration, an opportunity to incorporate new knowledge and strengthen communal bonds. The intentional erosion of their dwellings fit perfectly into this cycle. It ensured that no single structure became permanent or sacred beyond the need for improvement. The community was constantly engaged in a process of collective maintenance and knowledge transfer, where the elders who remembered the last repair would guide the younger generations in implementing a better solution. This fostered an incredible social resilience, binding the community together through a shared, ongoing project of adaptation. Their strength came not from building something that would last forever, but from creating a culture that knew exactly how to rebuild. The echoes of this ancient wisdom resonate powerfully in the most cutting-edge principles of sustainable architecture today. Modern engineers and designers are increasingly looking to these ancient practices for inspiration in a field now known as design for disassembly. The idea is to create buildings where materials can be easily separated, repaired, and reused at the end of their life cycle, rather than being demolished and sent to a landfill. The ancestral Pueblones were masters of this. Their use of local, biodegradable materials and their modular construction techniques meant that a collapsed wall could be largely recycled into a new one with minimal waste. Their entire approach was a profound lesson in working within an ecosystem rather than attempting to dominate it. They understood that the most enduring form of resilience isn't about creating a perfect, unchanging monument. It is about fostering a community and an architecture that is intelligent, adaptable, and humble enough to learn from its own graceful decay, finding strength not in permanence, but in the endless, wise cycle of renewal. High in the thin, dry air of 9th century Persia, a scholar named al-Battani carefully adjusted a massive brass ring mounted on a stone wall, his eyes fixed on the precise calibration marks etched into its surface. This was no ordinary instrument. It was a mural quadrant, a device for measuring the altitude of stars, but its design held a hidden intention. The marble base into which it was set was not perfectly stable. It was designed to shift minutely with the seasonal changes in temperature, ensuring that the instrument would, over time, fall out of its precise alignment. This was not an oversight. It was the entire point. Across the Islamic world, from Baghdad to Damascus and beyond, astronomers of the Golden Age were conducting a radical experiment in precision. They constructed their grand observatories not as temples of perfect, unchanging accuracy, but as dynamic workshops where the deliberate, anticipated failure of their instruments was the most valuable teacher in unlocking the secrets of the cosmos. These structures became the world's first true laboratories for the scientific method, where the relentless pursuit of knowledge was built upon a foundation of elegant, instructive imperfection. Historian Dr. Omar Khalidi, who has dedicated his career to studying the technical manuscripts from this era, explains the profound mindset behind these projects. The logs and treatises are remarkably candid, he notes. They don't hide what we would call errors. In fact, they celebrate them. They detail Ikhtilaf al-Mikyah's discrepancy of the scale, recording every minute misalignment not as a shameful mistake, but as an essential data point. The scholars understood that the path to ultimate accuracy was paved with countless small, documented inaccuracies. Each failure to align perfectly was a lesson in the properties of their materials, the limitations of their tools, and the subtle complexities of celestial motion. This philosophical acceptance of iterative error transformed the observatory from a mere viewing platform into a responsive, learning entity, a machine for generating not just star positions but deeper wisdom. The engineering choices made this learning process possible. Take the alidade, a sighting tool used for reading angles on a quadrant or astrolabe. Master craftsmen would construct these devices with exquisite care, but then intentionally mount them on pivots that had a barely perceptible amount of play. The marble used for the Grand Meridian arcs, the huge, fixed instruments embedded in an observatory's walls, was chosen not only for its smoothness but for its specific thermal expansion properties. It was meant to expand and contract with the desert's dramatic swing between day and night heat and chilling cold. This ensured that the instrument scale would change slightly each day, forcing the astronomers to constantly take new measurements of known reference stars to recalibrate their entire system. This daily ritual of adjustment, driven by built-in imperfection, honed their understanding of instrumental error to an incredible fine point. They weren't just measuring the stars, they were conducting a years-long study on the art and science of measurement itself. A powerful testament to this methodology is found in the legendary Marrakech Observatory, founded by the brilliant polymath Nasir al-Din al-Tusi in the 13th century. This was not a single building but a vast scientific campus, housing a library of over 400,000 volumes and a team of the era's greatest minds. Their primary goal was to create a new, more accurate star catalogue and planetary model, a project that required unprecedented precision. Early observations with their massive instruments, including a mural quadrant over 12 feet high, immediately revealed inconsistencies. Stars would appear in slightly different positions on successive nights, not because the heavens had changed, but because their understanding of their own tools was incomplete. Rather than despair, the team at Marrakech meticulously logged every discrepancy. They discovered that their initial calculations had not fully accounted for the way the metal of an alidade would flex under its own weight, or how atmospheric refraction near the horizon bent starlight. Each failed measurement was a puzzle to be solved. The solutions they developed were revolutionary. They invented new trigonometric techniques to correct for error and designed more robust instrument mountings. The star catalogue that eventually emerged from this process of continuous calibration, the Zij-i-Ilkhani, was the most accurate of its time, a masterpiece of precision born from 1,000 acknowledged imperfections. The intellectual ripple effects of this work would eventually wash over all of Europe, helping to fuel the scientific revolution. The meticulous records of Islamic astronomers, with their sophisticated mathematical models for correcting observational error, found their way into the hands of Renaissance scholars. Nicolaus Copernicus, in his quest to place the Sun at the center of the solar system, relied heavily on the planetary tables and observational data generated by these Eastern predecessors. Their comfort with iterative failure provided him with a more reliable dataset than any previously available. More importantly, it modeled a methodology, the idea that scientific truth is not revealed in a single, perfect observation, but is painstakingly constructed through a long, humble process of hypothesis, measurement, error, correction, and renewed hypothesis. The Marrakech Observatory and its peers taught the world that to understand the grand, perfect motions of the heavens, one must first embrace the small, messy imperfections of the earthly tools used to measure them. This profound lesson, that our instruments, and by extension our understanding, must be constantly refined through a respectful dialogue with their own failures, is perhaps their greatest legacy, one that continues to guide every modern scientist who ever recalibrates a machine or questions a result. Throughout history, these mysterious megastructures whisper a truth we've largely forgotten in our modern pursuit of flawless success: that there is profound wisdom in what breaks. From the Romans who watched their aqueducts collapse to refine an empire's plumbing, to the Mayan priests who read divine messages in the sinking corners of their pyramids, these cultures did not see failure as a final verdict. They saw it as the first and most important lesson. They embedded humility into their ambitions, understanding that to reach for the sky, one must first have a firm grasp on the ground, and sometimes that ground must be allowed to shift. These structures were not in points, they were conversations with the divine, with the forces of nature, and with the generations that would follow. Each crack, each lean, each controlled collapse was a line in that dialogue, a question answered about the limits of material, the behavior of water, or the patterns of the stars. This long-lost philosophy offers us a crucial reframing today, as we confront our own monumental challenges, from rising seas and warming climates to the ethical frontiers of artificial intelligence. We often operate under the pressure to get it right the first time. We seek perfect, permanent solutions, but the past suggests a different path, one of intelligent experimentation, of building adaptive systems that are designed to learn from their own performance, even when that performance includes a managed breakdown. The ancient Khmer engineers who let their temples settle into the Cambodian jungle taught us that resilience is found in symbiosis, not domination. The Inca builders whose walls danced with earthquakes demonstrated that true strength lies in flexibility, not rigid resistance. This isn't a call for carelessness, it's a call for courage. It's the courage to prototype, to test in the real world, to observe carefully, and to adapt without ego. It's about building a foundation for a skyscraper that can tell us exactly how the soil beneath it behaves under stress, or designing a coastal barrier that teaches us about wave dynamics through its own gradual erosion. The greatest legacy of these ancient builders isn't the stone they left behind. It's the mindset they embodied. They achieved lasting impact not by trying to create something static and perfect, but by engaging in a continuous, respectful, and insightful dance with the very idea of failure. They challenge us to ask not just, will this work, but also, what will this teach us if it doesn't? So the next time you face a setback in your own projects or in your life, remember the leaning towers and the sinking temples. See if you can spot the lesson buried within the breakdown, because sometimes the most solid ground for future growth is found in the rubble of a well-understood failure.